The key was still in my hand when I heard the knock. I had just gotten home from signing the final paperwork. The apartment was officially mine now, transferred from my late mother's estate after 8 months of legal back and forth that had drained me in ways I couldn't fully explain, not just financially, emotionally. My mother had lived in that apartment for 31 years, and walking through those rooms without her felt like learning to breathe with one lung. But it was mine now, and I was standing in the hallway of my own house, keys in hand, already thinking about what I'd make for dinner. When the knock came at the front door, I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole, and my stomach dropped straight to the floor. My daughter-in-law was standing on my porch, and behind her, my son, and behind both of them, parked at the curb, a white moving truck. I stood there for a moment without moving, just breathing, just staring through that small circle of glass at a face I hadn't seen in 4 years. 4 years. That's how long it had been since my son's wife decided I was no longer welcome in their lives. 4 years since she told my son to choose her or me. 4 years since he chose her. And my phone went quiet, and birthday cards started coming back unopened. And I learned to stop waiting for calls that were never going to come. And now she was on my porch, with a moving truck. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. Because I've thought about this moment a lot since then, and I've tried to explain it to my sister and my friend Donna, and even to my therapist, and I'm not sure I've ever fully gotten it right. When you see someone who hurt you that deeply, someone who systematically cut you out of your own child's life, your body doesn't always do what your mind tells it to. I wasn't frozen because I was weak. I was frozen because some part of me was still the mother who used to drive my son to soccer practice, who stayed up until 2 in the morning helping him study for his chemistry final, who danced with him at his wedding even though my heart was already sensing something was wrong with the woman he'd chosen. That part of me needed a second to catch up with reality. 1 second. That's all I gave it. Then I opened the door. My daughter-in-law smiled first. That was always her move, the smile that came just a half beat too fast, too wide, practiced. My son stood slightly behind her, the way he always stood behind her now, like he'd learned to make himself smaller. Carol, she said, using my first name, which she knew I didn't like. I looked at the truck, then back at her. With a moving truck, I said. She laughed. The kind of laugh that's meant to make you feel like you're overreacting. We can explain. Can we come in? And here's where I surprised myself. Because 4 years ago, I would have stepped aside. I would have let them in, made coffee, sat down at my own kitchen table and listened to whatever version of reality she'd prepared for me, and I would have done all of that because I was so desperate to have my son back in my life that I would have accepted almost any terms, but I was 63 years old, and I had spent 4 years in therapy. And I had just signed the paperwork for my mother's apartment that morning, and I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I did not step aside. No, I said. You can explain from right there. Her smile flickered. Just for a moment. Then it came back. Slightly adjusted. Carol, we've had some financial difficulties. The house, we had to let it go. We've been staying with friends for the past few weeks and it's just not sustainable. And we heard about your mother's apartment. How did you hear about that? She blinked. Your sister mentioned it to someone at church. My sister, I repeated. I made a note of that for later, and we thought, given the size of the apartment, it makes perfect sense for all of us. We can help with expenses. We can... Stop. I held up my hand. I'm going to need you to stop talking for a moment. She stopped. My son looked at the porch floor. I looked at my son. Really looked at him. He was 41 years old, and he was staring at the wooden planks of my porch like he was 17 again and had just broken a window. Something in my chest moved, the way it always did when I looked at him. I don't think that ever goes away, regardless of what your children do to you. But I had learned the difference between loving your child and surrendering yourself to them. Honey, I said to him, and his head came up, and I saw his eyes were red at the rims. I love you. I have always loved you. And I'm going to say this as clearly as I can, so there is no confusion later. You are not moving into my mother's apartment. Neither of you are. My daughter-in-law's smile disappeared entirely. That's a little cold, don't you think? After everything, I agreed. Yes. We have nowhere to go. That is not my problem to solve. My voice was steady. I was slightly amazed by this. You made a choice 4 years ago. You told my son to cut me out of his life. And he did. I spent 4 years without a single phone call from my child. Not on Christmas. Not on my birthday. Not when I had my knee surgery and couldn't walk for 3 weeks. Not once. And now you're standing on my porch with a moving truck because you heard I came into a property and you expect me to open my door. She opened her mouth. I kept going. I want you both to listen to me very carefully. I am not opening this door further than it is right now. That truck is not going to be unloaded at this address. And if you are not off my property in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to call the police and report a trespassing situation. Do you understand me? The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had heard in years. My daughter-in-law recovered first. She always recovered first. You're being completely irrational. We're family. You ended that, I said. Not me. Your son is standing right here. I know where my son is standing. I looked at him again. Sweetheart, if you want to talk, really talk. Just the two of us. No agenda. No moving truck, you call me. You have my number. I assume you still have my number. He didn't say anything. He was looking at his wife now. That particular look I had seen at his wedding reception and hadn't known what to name yet. I knew what to name it now. It was the look of someone who had learned that peace in his home required his silence everywhere else. My daughter-in-law turned to him. Are you going to let her talk to me like that? He looked at his shoes again. 10 minutes, I said. I mean it. I stepped back inside and closed the door. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the particular adrenaline of doing something you should have done years earlier, and knowing, at the same time, that it cost you something real. I stood in my hallway for a moment, listening. I heard my daughter-in-law's voice, sharp and low, talking at my son. I heard him say something that I couldn't make out. I heard footsteps on the porch. Then I heard the truck engine start. I sat down on my hallway bench and put my face in my hands and let myself feel it, all of it, for about 3 minutes. The grief of it, the absurdity, the relief. Then I called my sister. Did you tell someone at your church about Mother's apartment? I asked when she picked up. A pause. Oh, Carol, I mentioned it to Pam Wheeler, I didn't think. Pam Wheeler is my daughter-in-law's aunt's neighbor. I need you to be more careful. Oh, God. Did something happen? I'll explain later. I took a breath. I'm fine. I handled it. But I need you to be more careful. After I hung up with my sister, I sat in my hallway for a long time. The light was changing, going from afternoon gold to that early evening gray that I've always found melancholy. I thought about my mother. I thought about all the evenings I had spent in her apartment when I was young, sitting at her kitchen table doing my homework while she made dinner. The specific smell of her cooking, the way she used to hum without realizing she was doing it. I thought about how she had signed that apartment into my name a year before she died because she knew what she was doing. Because she was that kind of practical, deliberate woman, and I thought about what she would have said if she'd seen what happened on my porch an hour ago. She would have said, "Good girl, took you long enough." She wasn't wrong. I want to tell you about the weeks that followed, because this story didn't end at my front door. Nothing like this ever ends cleanly. My son called me 3 days later. He called from what sounded like a parking lot. I could hear cars in the background, which told me he was somewhere his wife wasn't. That told me something I had already suspected. "Mom?" he said. Just that. Just the word. And the way he said it was like watching a wall that had been standing too long finally start to show its cracks. "I'm here," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry. I know. I don't know how to explain what these 4 years have been. You don't have to explain it to me," I said. I've seen marriages like yours, honey. I understand more than you think. She's not a bad person. I'm not asking you to choose, I said. I never asked you to choose. That was her requirement, not mine. I just need you to understand that I cannot be treated as an option that gets picked up again when circumstances make it convenient. I'm your mother. I have never stopped loving you, but I also have to protect myself now. I'm 63 years old, and I don't have the energy for half relationships anymore. He was quiet again. I could hear him breathing. Are you safe? I asked. Because I needed to know. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I'm safe. We're staying with her cousin. It's fine. We'll figure it out. Okay. Can I see you sometime, just us? Call me, I said. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here. And then ungo and come. I'll be here, he called again the following week. And the week after that, we met for coffee the third week, at a diner halfway between my house and where he was staying. He looked tired. He looked like someone who had been holding something very heavy for a long time and was only now starting to consider putting it down. We talked for 2 hours, and I didn't bring up his wife once, and he brought her up twice, both times, with a particular careful phrasing that told me he was still managing what he said around the subject of her. But he was there. He was sitting across from me, and he was real, and he was my son, and that was something. I should tell you about the apartment. My mother's apartment is on the 3rd floor of a building in a neighborhood that has been slowly becoming beautiful again after years of not being much of anything. The building is old 1940s, with the kind of bones that newer buildings don't have. Thick plaster walls and tall windows and radiators that knock in the night like someone sending code. My mother had filled it with decades of her life. Photographs and books and a ceramic rooster collection that she'd started in 1978. And never been able to explain the origin of. I spent 3 weekends clearing it out after she died, and it was some of the hardest work I have ever done, not because it was physically demanding, but because every box was a decision about what to keep and what to let go. I kept the ceramic roosters. I don't know why. I set them up on the kitchen windowsill, and they look completely insane, and I love them. What I want you to understand about the apartment is what it represented. This was not a beach house. This was not an investment property. This was 31 years of my mother's life, converted into a deed with my name on it. And what my daughter-in-law had shown up on my porch expecting to walk into wasn't just real estate. It was my inheritance. Not the financial kind, the other kind. The kind you can't measure. My daughter-in-law called me once, about 6 weeks after the porch incident. I didn't recognize the number and picked up, thinking it might be a doctor's office. When I realized who it was, I almost ended the call immediately. I didn't, partly out of curiosity, partly out of some residual Catholic guilt that I've been working on for decades. She wanted to talk. She said she thought we'd gotten off on the wrong foot, which was such a remarkable way to describe a 4-year estrangement and an attempted takeover of my inherited property that I had to actually put the phone against my chest for a moment so she wouldn't hear me exhale. I'm not sure this conversation is going to go the way you want it to, I said when I came back. I just think if you could understand our situation. I understand your situation. You lost your house and you needed somewhere to go, and you thought, given the history, that I would be the easiest option to lean on. Silence. That's not wrong, is it? I said. More silence. Here's what I want you to hear, I said. Not for your sake, really, but for mine. I do not wish you harm. I genuinely don't. But I am not going to be available for this kind of outreach. If you and my son build something healthy, if there ever comes a time when we can all be in the same room without there being an agenda, I'm open to that. But I need you to stop calling me about things that aren't that. She hung up. I set down the phone and looked at the ceramic roosters on my kitchen windowsill, and I thought about my mother again. And I thought about how long it took me to become the person she always knew I could be. She used to say to me, when I was going through my divorce in my 40s, a whole separate chapter that I'll spare you tonight. She used to say, "Carol, you are not a hotel. You do not have to accommodate everyone who shows up at your door." I've been thinking about that a lot lately. The apartment has become something I didn't expect, a project, something to care for, to restore slowly, to make into something that is entirely and only mine. I had the kitchen repainted. I replaced the bathroom tiles, a project that took 2 weekends and a great deal of YouTube tutorial watching and turned out imperfectly, and I am proud of every crooked grout line. I found a second-hand armchair at an estate sale that my mother would have called hideous and that I think is perfect. And I put it by the tall window in the living room, and I sit there in the mornings with my coffee. I am 63 years old. I have raised a child, buried a husband, lost a mother, built and rebuilt and built again. I have spent a considerable portion of my adult life making myself smaller to fit into the spaces that other people left for me. I don't do that anymore. My son came to see the apartment last month. Just him, on a Sunday afternoon. He brought flowers, carnations, which used to be my mother's favorite, which he knew because he remembered, because underneath everything he had learned about surviving in his marriage, he was still a son who paid attention. I put them in a vase on the kitchen table and made him lunch, and we sat at my mother's table in her apartment that was now mine, and we talked for 3 hours about real things, hard things, the kind of conversation we hadn't had in 4 years. He's in therapy now. He told me that like it was a confession. I told him that was one of the best things he'd ever done. He looked around the apartment at some point, at the photographs I'd put up and the roosters on the windowsill and the new armchair by the window, and he said, "Mom, this is really nice." "It is," I agreed. "She's not going to let this go easily, you know, the apartment, the property thing." "I know. She still thinks." "Honey," I looked at him steadily, "it doesn't matter what she still thinks. The deed has my name on it. The locks have my keys. What she thinks about it is between her and whatever she decides to do about that." He was quiet for a moment. "You've changed." "I've always been this person," I said. "I just got tired of pretending I wasn't." He nodded slowly, looking at his coffee cup. Then he looked up at me, and for a moment, he looked exactly like the 11-year-old who used to fall asleep on the couch watching movies. And I felt that specific ache that I think only mothers understand, the ache of watching your child navigate a world you couldn't protect them from. Knowing that the best thing you can do now is simply remain. "I'm sorry it took me this long," he said. "You're here now," I said, and I meant it. Not as consolation, not as absolution. He still had work to do, and he knew that. I meant it as a plain statement of fact. He was here, in my kitchen, eating my food, looking at my roosters. Whatever came next, that was real, and it was ours, and nobody had the power to move into it without an invitation. I learned something on that porch. The day I looked through the peephole and saw the moving truck, I learned that the moment I had been dreading, the moment of confrontation, of finally saying the word no without softening it, without apologizing for it, without immediately following it with a yes to something smaller, that moment wasn't as hard as all the years of not doing it. All those years I spent being accommodating had cost me more than one firm conversation would ever cost me. My therapist would call that a breakthrough. My mother would have called it being raised right, just slowly. My sister called it about time, which made me laugh harder than I had in months. I call it mine. My apartment, my morning, my armchair by the window, my ceramic roosters that make no visual sense against the pale kitchen walls, my son's carnations in a clear vase on a table that belonged to the woman who taught me every important thing I know. It's all mine, and the next person who knocks on my door with a moving truck is going to find out very quickly that things are different now. If you're watching this and you're going through something like what I went through, if you have a family member who treats your generosity like a resource to be managed, if you've been standing aside for years because you couldn't figure out how to stop, I want you to hear this. You are allowed to close the door. You are allowed to not take the call. You are allowed to love someone and still not give them your keys. Your home is not a compromise. It is your life. and you worked too hard and too long to hand it over to someone who never asked how you were doing until they needed something from you. I know. I almost did it. I almost stepped aside and let them in, because he was my son and she was his wife, and the moving truck was right there, and the moment felt too big to stop. But I had a mother who spent 31 years in an apartment she made beautiful by herself. And she put my name on the deed for a reason. I wasn't going to let her down.